Well, good morning, Gospel Fellowship, and anyone else able to join us out there. We're continuing our study of First Corinthians. Today we get into an interesting chapter, chapter 11, or at least a very interesting part of the chapter. This is the passage where Paul talks about head coverings. It's a bit of a challenging passage, not only because of sorting through how to apply it and understand some of what Paul says, but also because of the great volume of literature and commentary that has been written on it. There are some things that are indeed difficult to understand and sort through. One thing that's interesting that you'll find in reading the scriptures that there are occasionally times when what is most bizarre and uncertain to us is what was most clear, probably to the original readers, especially when you get into some particular cultural references. Those are the things that everybody knew, and then we sometimes scratch our head over. But it is a passage that I hope we can find some benefit in, not only in understanding how and why Paul speaks the way that he does, but even in terms of learning to apply it in our own practice and certainly in our own understanding. Let me read the entirety of the passage that we're going to be looking at today. I will warn you now that if you're listening to this, this is one of those classes, one of those sessions where it will be, I think, fairly important for you to have a Bible in front of you. We're certainly always making use of the Word of God in these classes. But today, some of what we're going to be sorting through is going to depend upon a little bit more of a careful look at the text and understanding some of what Paul says, that I think you'll have a much better time of tracking with us if you have the scriptures open in front of you. It also may be a little bit of a longer time than sometimes in the past. But let's read the passage and we'll make some introductory comments before diving into what I think is some of the theological meat of this text. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 11. I will begin in verse 2. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. A couple comments I'd like to make by way of introduction, especially in terms of framing and giving some sort of context to what Paul is describing in these verses. The first is actually to notice the way in which Paul introduces this section himself. He says right at the beginning, "Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you." Now it's worth noting how that differs from what he says in the passage immediately following what we just read. Look, if you would, to verse 17. But, making a contrast, but in the following instructions I do not commend you, And then he goes on talking about some issues with regard to the Lord's Supper. Now, the reason why that's important is because we need to understand that what Paul is doing, or at least what he has said, is that he is fundamentally commending them for what they're doing. He is commending them in this practice. If there is any correction that Paul is giving, and certainly he is giving a measure of correction, he is correcting them not by way of rebuke, but he is correcting by way of instruction. He is correcting those who are indeed putting into practice what are the basic things that Paul has delivered to them, that he has instructed them in, and he is instructing them further as to how to do it well and more appropriately. He's not rebuking those who are rebellious. He is instructing those who need further help. So just as an illustration, if I tell my daughter, say, to clean up her room, and 10 minutes later I find her room not clean, she's sitting in the middle of the floor playing with the toys, and the room is more of a mess than it was 10 minutes ago. Does she need rebuke or instruction? Well, it's a correction by way of rebuke. She did not do what I asked her to do. What if, on the other hand, after 10 minutes, I find that her floor is clean, but most of her toys are put away, but then all sorts of other random things are piled on top of her dresser, and it's very clear that they don't have any real place to go. Does she need rebuke at that point? Well, of course not. She is certainly trying to put into practice everything that I had just asked her to do. It's simply a matter of instruction, perhaps, in how to clean up some of those other odds and ends. So something similar is taking place in this passage. Paul is most basically commending them for what they're doing. Well, what is he commending them for? Well, very, very briefly, and this is mostly in considering the context of the following chapters that come in 1 Corinthians, looking especially at 1 Corinthians 11 through 14, but also moving into 15 a bit. What he is commending them for is receiving from him what is the apostolic testimony, and for them in gathering together in public worship of God that centers upon the Spirit-empowered word ministry given to the church. That's a lot to take in, but basically that they are coming together in worship, and that their worship centers around what is the use of word gifts given by the Holy Spirit. So that's why there's an emphasis on something like prophecy. Paul is not wanting to discourage the use of those things, but rather to say that in general, and most basically, he is commending them for what they're doing, but then he is still wanting to instruct. That's the first thing in terms of understanding the tone that Paul is striking as he comes to them. The second important thing by way of context is understanding some of the challenges of cultural symbolism that arise in this section. Cultural symbolism. Now, the first place I want to turn is actually, again, in the text itself. Notice, let's look at verse 14, where Paul ends with this kind of interesting supporting argument based on what he says is an understanding of nature. So listen to this in verse 14. Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? Now, it's interesting, sometimes that's used, it's a text that's used to say that men are supposed to have short hair and women are supposed to have long hair. Now, it's interesting, a very conservative exegete and scholar, someone who many of whom have leaned upon, I myself very much have appreciated, John Calvin, is one who, when he comes across this verse, he actually understands that when Paul speaks of nature here, he's referring not simply to the way that things are created and therefore ought to be, but it's the use of nature to speak of what is more broadly and culturally received. So this is culturally received practice. Calvin, like many of us, I would hope, would recognize that in different cultures, different places, different times, there are times when it is not shameful for a man perhaps to have longer hair, or even perhaps it's not shameful for a woman to have shorter hair. Those are things that it's not so, they're not universal realities. So what's Paul doing here? Where Paul is rather making use of the particular received cultural practice that distinguishes men and women. There is a way in which they do things in which one thing is perhaps appropriate for men, but then it would be strange for the same thing to happen for women, and vice versa. One thing is expected in terms of the way in which women have their hair or dress or whatever, and it would be odd to see the same kind of thing coming from men. And the point that Paul is making is he is simply referring to what is a generally received distinction between men and women, how they publicly carry themselves and are presented. And he's simply saying, look, everybody recognizes that there is some way of visually seeing a difference between men and women. Shouldn't we also have something similar in terms of the church? He's simply referencing that. Now, another place where cultural symbolism is important is in particular as it relates to head coverings. Now, as much as this seems to be the focus in what Paul is describing, I do simply want to make some very brief comments on this. The first is that as it relates to men having their head covered when praying or prophesying, some think that probably the cultural context for this is perhaps that men would sometimes cover their head in approaching in pagan worship, approaching a god in worship, or perhaps presenting a sacrifice or something like that, as a way of visibly humbling himself before the gods. So it's kind of an act or sign of humility in a sense. Another kind of interesting cultural point is that when it comes to women having their heads covered or uncovered, one thought here is that perhaps a woman having her hair unbound or head uncovered is, in a public setting, is a way of perhaps presenting herself in a sexually suggestive or available way. So that one commentator says this, that if she were to wear a kind of veil or hood in a public setting, it constituted a warning. It signified that the wearer was a respectable woman and that no man dare approach her. In other words, that if someone would approach her and try to assume that she's available or something like that, then he's going to have to deal with more than just her, namely her husband, her family, etc. So something similar to a wedding ring. I have this ring, and it actually signifies a promise that my wife made to me. It shows not something about me. Well, it does show something about me, that I belong to my wife, but it also shows what is my wife's pledge to me, so that this should show you and visibly make clear that if you come near me, you got to deal with my wife. You don't want to have to do that, especially when it comes to me belonging to her, and vice versa. You approach my wife, you got to deal with me. That's something similar is seen in terms of the visible kind of cultural interpretation of perhaps having a sort of head covering. So that Paul's point, and we'll get into why this might be the case later, Paul's point in the head covering, at least as it relates to women, is that there is a visible association together with her husband, or perhaps even with her family, as some may think. There's a visible bond that is put on display. Now, what that means, and sort of considering some of the cultural symbolism here, is that what's going to be most interesting for us is understanding the theological framework that Paul uses to undergird the practice that he holds out to them. Some of the cultural things are certainly different here, but Paul is still holding it up and supporting it with a theological structure that is important for us to understand and to receive. Now, the third point in terms of context, we look at the fact that Paul is on the whole commending them, but then wanting to give a correction by way of instruction. That Paul recognizes what are some of what is the cultural symbolism at work here. So we want to be careful in terms of how we too quickly draw lines of some of the things that we do or don't do. But number three, the particular practice that Paul is regulating is interesting. Paul describes it as praying or prophesying. Perhaps very closely associated ideas, maybe distinct, but probably actually very close to one another, praying or prophesying. Now, as we go through the book of 1 Corinthians, I want to just notice that the idea of prophecy actually comes out much more, not only in beginning in chapter 12 and repeated a few times, but it actually begins to become much more the focus in chapter 14. Chapter 14 of 1 Corinthians, Paul describes prophecy, and as I understand it, prophecy being what is a spirit-empowered and spirit-enabled and spirit-gifted revelation. I actually take a very strong view of the prophecy that is involved here. You can see that in verse 26 and following of chapter 14, where prophecy seems to be parallel to this idea of making known a revelation. But what's interesting is that as Paul describes prophecy and tongues, he speaks about tongues in an interesting way. In 1 Corinthians 14, verse 13, he says, "One who speaks in a tongue should pray that he may interpret. For if I pray in a tongue, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful." Now, I don't want to get into all that Paul's describing in terms of tongues, but it seems to be that on the whole, the idea is that tongues, insofar as they are uninterpreted and then not understood, are essentially and just simply praying to God. He's the one who understands. No one else does. It's unto him. I wonder, and this is sort of a much more tentative kind of conclusion, but my sense in looking at 1 Corinthians 11 is that might be some of what Paul has in mind when he describes praying or prophesying. Things that are very closely tied together in terms of the function of spirit-empowered word ministry in the life of God's people. So with that in mind then, what that means, and especially as it relates to prophecy, is that Paul is regulating something that in my view is unique to the apostolic age. Prophecy functioned at a time when the scriptures, the New Testament scriptures, had not yet been fully given. Prophecy was enabled both as a way of showing that the Holy Spirit had indeed been poured out upon his church, but also making known to the church what the church needs in order to be built upon the one foundation, namely Jesus Christ. So that prophecy is something that has a unique function at that particular time in history to see that the church is built upon the proclamation of what Christ has done in his death and resurrection. And Paul is regulating here what is the use of a uniquely apostolic age gift in the public worship of God. As they come together, Paul is wanting to regulate that. So that what this means then is that as we understand what is the theological structure underneath what Paul is describing and what he is commending to the church, how it is that they are to order their practice, he is applying it to something that is redemptive, historically unique for them, but still to be applied to us, though perhaps in other circumstances and other ways. I'll just hold out to you now, though we don't unfortunately have enough time to look too much at this text, but 1 Timothy 2 is one of those places where Paul takes precisely the same theological framework that we're going to see in 1 Corinthians 11 and applies it to what is the ordinary and ongoing practice of the church. What I think relates most especially to something like ordained office. 1 Timothy 2, verse 12 and following, or verse 11 and following, I'll let you read that on your own, where Paul actually describes, well, I'll read some of it. He says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor, and he moves on from there. At that point, Paul leans on what is the same or very similar kind of theology as he will go to in 1 Corinthians 11 to regulate what is the ongoing practice of the church. But in 1 Corinthians 11, he's regulating what is a unique practice, at least to that historical period in the life of the church. Now, we've said a lot by way of introduction, but the purpose of all of this is to at least make a case for why what we are going to do in looking at this passage, why we are going to try to focus on some of the theological statements that Paul makes. Because Paul presents what is a theology and understanding, or really an understanding of the history of redemption that actually frames that practice. And that's going to be the same kind of understanding that we need to have in terms of framing the practice of the church, especially like in a passage in 1 Timothy 2, when Paul talks about something like ordained office. Now here's what I'm going to do. I've already taken probably about 20 minutes to introduce some of this. I am going to read for you what is my best attempt, and I'm certainly willing to continue to try to refine this, my best attempt at giving what is the basic framework that Paul uses in understanding, in trying to regulate the church's practice in 1 Corinthians 11, as well as a passage like 1 Timothy 2, my best understanding as to why Paul speaks the way that he does. And I will tell you that I'm certainly informed by more passages than just these two. But let me read this. I'll read it twice for the sake of clarity and trying to get all of these pieces. And then what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to stop this video and then I'll have a part 2. So if it's maybe too much to sort of keep going at this point, I'll just read this, and then next time or in the next video we will jump right into looking at some of the theology that Paul unfolds. Listen to this. This is my summary here, that the gender distinct practice which Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16, what we just read, and in a passage like 1 Timothy 2, 11-15, the gender distinct practice which Paul describes is the church's public, symbolic recognition of the way past covenant history provides the pattern for our present covenant hope. In other words, just as the human race began this way, Adam first, then the woman, so also the church's entrance into glory unfolds this way. Christ first, then the church. So the point is this, that Paul is wanting to say that what takes place in terms of the public ordering of the church is actually supposed to remind us of something that is true for the church as a whole. Christ has come, he's entered into his glory, but as Paul will try to make the point later in 1 Corinthians 15, the church has not yet entered into that glory. But of course, in Christ Jesus is the pledge and promise that we surely will. So let me read this again, because this is the framework that I think lies behind how Paul speaks in terms of the gender distinct practice here. The gender distinct practice which Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 11 and a passage like 1 Timothy 2 is the church's public, symbolic recognition of the way past covenant history provides the pattern for our present covenant hope. So here's the past covenant history. Just as the human race began this way, Adam first, then the woman. Now here's our present covenant hope. So also the church's entrance into glory unfolds this way. Christ first, then the church. Just as the human race began this way, Adam first, then the woman. So also the church's entrance into glory unfolds this way. Christ first, then the church. That is the central idea that I think frames and undergirds Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 11, as well as a passage like 1 Timothy 2, though what makes these passages different is that 1 Corinthians 11 regulates what is a temporary and unique gifting given indiscriminately to men and women in the church, whereas 1 Timothy 2 is a way of regulating an understanding of ordained and perpetual office in the life of the church, at least until Christ comes. So two very different passages, at least in that regard, but framed in terms of the same basic foundation. I'm going to pause here. We've been talking for about 26 minutes or so. I want to give you a chance to maybe take a break and come back to this topic at some other point. I will have another video that's posted. Look out for it to continue our time together. Thanks a lot. Bye.